Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us today. Why don't we get started? I'm Paul Saunders. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. We're pleased to see such a big group in the middle of August in Washington. The traffic led me to think that the city was a little bit depopulated, but the attendance clearly demonstrates otherwise. And we appreciate all of you taking the time to come and be with us. I think we'll have a very interesting conversation today about the new U.S. sanctions on Russia. We have a couple of highly experienced speakers who will give us some perspective on that. And we're quite grateful to them, too, for taking the time out of their day to be with us. To my right, we have Dan Russell, who's the president and CEO of the U.S.-Russia Business Council. Dan is a former career diplomat who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, arms control, some other matters. During the previous administration, the Obama administration, was also the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and the U.S. Embassy in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, in addition to a number of other important posts. To my left is George Beebe, who is Senior Director for, we're calling you Director for Intelligence Programs at the Center for the National Interest. George was a career U.S. intelligence professional who led the Russia Analysis Unit at the Central Intelligence Agency. He was an advisor on Russia to Vice President Dick Cheney during the Bush administration. And he's also the president of a data analytics firm called Behavior Matrix. So we're very pleased to have both of them with us today. We will start with Dan. I've asked each of Dan and George to speak for about 10 minutes.
Well, thanks, Paul. I'll try to hold to your 10 minutes. We're dealing with a pretty complicated piece of legislation, so I don't know what justice I can do to it in 10, but I'll try. I'm going to come at this from largely a business community perspective because I think George can speak to the other, but I think it's worth spending a minute to talk about how we got here and to look back to 2014 at the sanctions regime that was put in place by the Obama administration through a series of executive orders. And I think if you look at those sanctions, I mean, there were really two key elements, one old and one new. The old element was a traditional list of banned individuals and entities who were subject to an asset freeze and a travel ban. So Americans were banned from financial transactions with the individuals and entities who were put on the so-called specially designated national list, or SDNs in sanction speak. The new element in the Obama sanctions were really sectoral sanctions, which were something new that they'd not done before. So rather than an outright ban, what you had were limited sanctions, particularly on the financial sector and on the energy sector. On designated financial institutions, you had a maturity threshold on new U.S. debt or equity of 30 days. And on designated energy companies, you had a maturity threshold on a new U.S. equity or debt limited to 90 days. And you also had a prohibition on the delivery of goods, services, or technology for the exploration and production of new deep water, Arctic offshore, or shale projects that had the potential to produce oil. I think there are three features of the Obama administration sanctions that are probably worth highlighting here. And first, in terms of intent, the sanctions were targeted as a specific policy response to Russia's incorporation of Crimea and its support for separatists in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The design, as the White House said from the outset, was a set of sanctions that were flexible, scalable, and reversible depending on Russia's response, specifically with regard to the fulfillment of the Minsk agreement. And the third thing I'd flag was the coordination part with America's allies. The sanctions design was really developed and coordinated as part of a multilateral package with the European Union and some other partners like Canada. And I think we certainly saw unprecedented cooperation with Europe over the past 3 years on this front. And this was predicated on the idea that the only effective sanctions would be multilateral ones. Europe's response was largely supportive, and certainly the sanctions regime has held together over the past 3 years, despite what a lot of folks thought. Russia's primary response to the Obama administration sanctions was a series of counter-sanctions of its own, basically banning food and agricultural products from North America and the EU. In terms of the impact on Russia's economy, I mean, with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, we can say it was pretty limited. And if you're looking for a data point, I would look at the World Bank's GDP forecast for Russia for last year that looked at an alternate scenario with all sanctions lifted against Russia, and they saw a GDP bump up of 0.8%, but only for a year, because Russia's real economic problems are structural reforms that need to be addressed. And I think the major impact on American business and international business came largely from the oil price drop and the ruble devaluation. So sanctions in that way were more of a catalyst for the downturn than a primary cause. I mean, the effect was, of course, disproportionate on smaller businesses as always. For large corporations already present in the Russian market, really the task of the day was to cut operating expenses and postpone whatever expansion plans you had. Few major players left the Russian market. Conversely, you had few new entrants into the market through this period. So I just wanted to start there as a backdrop to kind of give us a frame to talk about what we've got now. So turning to the new sanctions in H.R. 3364, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions, that was signed into law by the President on August 2nd. This is a very long and complicated piece of legislation, even if you just look at the Russia part. It's almost 90 pages of Title II, and I think I'd highlight a few of those. I think, first and foremost, it codifies the existing sanctions into law. So basically, those 4 executive orders from the Obama administration era on Ukraine-related sanctions, plus 2 more on cybersecurity. I think the second major thing is it mandates, the bill, or the law now, mandates a congressional review of sanctions-related actions. Basically, the president can't really do much in terms of trying to waive or ease sanctions without consulting with Congress during at least a 30-day period. I think the third important thing that the bill does is it expands the scope of existing sanctions and imposes new mandatory sanctions, notably in energy, financial services, and the defense intelligence sectors. And it also authorizes sanctions, discretionary sanctions in rail, mining, and metal sectors, as well as on energy pipelines. There are some key sections there which we can go into if people want in the Q&A. I think 2 other sections I would highlight are on export pipelines and privatization. Both of these have caused some concern in the business community. The export pipelines ones are discretionary. The ones on privatization are mandatory. So like I said, we can talk more about specific provisions of the bill, I think, if we want in the Q&A. The bill, I think, as you all know, passed with overwhelming support in both houses. I mean, the vote in the House was 419 to 3, and on the original Senate bill was 98 to 2. I would make a comment on the process as somebody who used to work on Capitol Hill a long time ago, and this is not limited to just this bill, but we had a very truncated legislative process, and I'd like to see a return to regular order where you have traditional hearings, you have the open and closed markups, and you certainly have input from the stakeholders and the public. But we didn't really have that in the case on this bill. In terms of kind of looking at the same things I tried to do in the Obama administration sanctions, looking at intent, I think you've got to look at the statements that have been made by key congressional leaders. I mean, House Speaker Ryan said that the bill, quote, tightens the screws on our most dangerous adversaries in order to keep Americans safe. Senate Minority Leader Schumer said that, quote, passing the bill on a bipartisan basis sends a strong signal to the White House that the Kremlin needs to be held accountable for meddling in last year's election. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Corker said that the Russian government continues to violate the sovereignty of Ukraine, aggravate the crisis in Syria, and destabilize democracies around the world. And this amendment makes clear that we will not tolerate such actions. But I think it's interesting that Corker added that this amendment is also an important step as we continue our efforts to reassert congressional authority. So I think when you look at these things taken together, clearly you have Russian actions plus challenges to the executive branch discretionary authority that are the targets of the legislation. On design, this is certainly a more comprehensive approach, much less targeted in terms of scope, and not as clearly linked to straightforward Russian actions that could result in the lifting or easing of sanctions. I think coordination is certainly an issue, particularly with America's allies. That's been a real issue. And I think, again, if you look at the reaction in Europe, you'll get a pretty good idea of where people are. The president of the European Commission said that the European Commission reserves the right to take adequate measures. If U.S. sanctions specifically disadvantage U.S. companies trading with Russia in the energy sector, the EU is prepared to take appropriate steps in response within days. And he said, quote, we must defend our economic interests vis-a-vis the United States, and we will do that. The German foreign minister echoed largely the same sentiments, calling on President Trump to consult with EU member countries before implementing these sanctions, and asserted that the sanction bill, quote, quite openly admits that it pursues economic interests and that we do not think this is acceptable, unquote. So again, quite a different view there. In terms of the impact, I think this is a refrain you're going to hear probably throughout this session. I think the biggest concern is about implementation. The bill is not clear. It has many, many different timelines and many, many different pieces. So I think implementation is truly going to be key. I think from the I'd look in terms of initial reactions, I could give you kind of the range. I mean, S&P, Standard & Poor's, and Moody's have both taken a look at this and come out with kind of contradictory views. S&P's Global Ratings said after the bill was passed that it did not expect new sanctions to have significant negative consequences for their outlook on the Russian economy. But nonetheless noted that the new sanctions raise uncertainty in European gas markets. Moody's Investor Services said that expanded U.S. sanctions may have a negative effect on Russia's credit outlook because they will likely deter investment and further exacerbate tension between Russia and the West. So that's kind of the range. I think the business community, or most of the businesses I deal with, their big concerns, which go back to the original Senate bill, are about how does this affect America's global competitiveness, and how does it affect the competitiveness of American companies vis-a-vis their European and Asian counterparts? And I think that's what business community is focused on, and I still think those are the biggest issues. And I think we all plan to work with the Trump administration, with OFAC, with the State Department, to try to make sure that implementation leaves a level playing field for American businesses in Russia and in Europe. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. George.
Okay, so Paul asked me to focus on the question of whether these new sanctions will affect Russian behavior or not. And there's a fairly short and easy answer to that question, and that is yes, it will. The bad news is that it's probably not going to affect Russian behavior in the ways that we hope. It's likely to be counterproductive. And I want to walk through my reasoning behind that conclusion. The first is the nature of deterrence and how you deter adversaries. There are two aspects to deterrence that are important in these particular sanctions. The first is that punishment has to be credible. If the person that you're looking to deter doesn't believe that you will follow through with punishment, if he thinks it's a bluff, then he has little incentive to comply with your demands. That's not a problem in the case of these sanctions. The Russians know very well that they're going to be punished. So credibility of punishment is a box that we can check off here. But there's a flip side to this, and that is the person that you're looking to deter also has to believe that if he complies with your demands, that you won't follow through with punishment. And that's a big problem with this particular piece of legislation. It provides lots of opportunities to escalate punishment, so it's flexible, according to that flexible, scalable, and reversible. Is flexible going up, it's scalable going up. But the reversible part of this, the de-escalation provisions are quite lacking. In fact, I think for the domestic political purposes that Dan alluded to, Congress wanted to make it very difficult for the president to relax or lift these sanctions. Now, what that does, I think, is it creates some perverse incentives from Moscow's point of view. The Russians are probably going to believe that they're going to be punished regardless of their behavior. And that actually incentivizes them to defy us on this particular issue. And part of the reason for that is history. The Russians understand very well the history of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, passed in 1974. Its target was to impose economic penalties on the Soviet Union because it was not relaxing restrictions on Jewish immigration. But those economic penalties remained on the books until 2012, long past the point when Moscow was restricting any Jewish immigration. And even after the Russians did a number of very positive things in the wake of 9/11, where they provided intelligence and logistics support to our counterterrorist operations, they closed down their intelligence facility in Cuba, shut down the naval facility in Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam, all designed to send us very positive signals about their willingness to cooperate. And at a time when President Bush was overwhelmingly popular domestically, the Republican Party controlled both House and Senate on Capitol Hill, we still did not lift those Jackson-Vanik restrictions. The conclusion, I think, in Moscow of all of this is these sanctions are going to have a generational duration, at least. They will be a constant in the U.S.-Russian relationship going forward for decades from Russia's point of view. That's a very problematic thing when it comes to deterring bad Russian behavior on our part. The second variable here is not the sanctions themselves, but the context in the broader U.S.-Russian relationship within which this new law is going to be implemented. This is not conceived as a single response. It's not just the full extent of our punishment of Moscow for its bad behavior. It is one element that is part of a package that is likely to include several other steps, such as the reports that the U.S. is seriously considering providing lethal aid to Ukraine, the Washington Post report that President Obama, prior to leaving office, had authorized the U.S. Cyber community to implant what it called cyber weapons in critical Russian infrastructure that could be detonated in the future at some point. The pressures on Capitol Hill to step up what the U.S. military calls information operations against Russia to retaliate for their propaganda activities in the United States. These are all things that are likely to be coming down the road fairly soon. And the cumulative impact of all those steps, I think, is likely to condition how Russia responds to the sanctions. The Russians can't do a whole lot in the economic area that wouldn't also hurt their own economic interests, so I expect them to do a few things in the economic area in retaliation, but they can do some things asymmetrically. And the initial Russian reaction to the passage of the sanctions that took the shape of a foreign ministry statement and then an interview that President Putin gave on national television a couple of days later, both of those alluded to some things that Russia could do asymmetrically that could impose some pain on the United States. And I'll just run through a list of some of those things right now that I think are likely to materialize in the next several days. I mentioned in the economic area we'll probably see some limited counter-sanctions. In the intelligence area, I think we're going to see an escalation of the ongoing intelligence war that's really going on between our respective intelligence services. And this won't just be expelling intelligence officers. There's likely to be an increase in harassment that's going on. And some of you may have noticed there was a CNN report a few days ago of U.S. persons in Cuba being attacked through acoustic weapons. This is the kind of retaliatory step that I think we might see more of, not just in Moscow, but in other capitals around the world. And it can be a very serious thing, physically endangering our personnel. In the cyber area, if in fact we follow through with that cyber weapon report that we saw in the Washington Post, I find it very unlikely that the Russians would sit by passively. I think there's very likely to be some sort of cyber retaliation in our infrastructure, which I think is even more vulnerable than Russia's infrastructure. And I think the last thing, and one that's most serious, is in Ukraine. I think if we do follow through with providing lethal weaponry to the Ukrainian government, the Russians are likely to retaliate both in Ukraine and elsewhere. And in two areas where I think we ought to be very careful would be North Korea and Iran. I could easily see the Russians not just stepping up economic and diplomatic support for those two regimes. It's easy to anticipate a military response of some kind, for example, providing defensive weapons to Pyongyang or Tehran that would be justified in Russia's mind as proportional defensive weapons provided to countries that they think have the right to do that, and whose possession of such weaponry I think would align with Russia's own interests and how they would like to see those situations handled. Last thing, Dan mentioned some differences of opinion between some of our European allies and the United States over how to handle Russia and how to handle the sanctions issue. This is an area where I would fully expect the Russians to exacerbate and exploit tensions between European capitals and Washington on this issue. I think we've provided an opening for them to do that, and I would expect to see Moscow take full advantage of that in the coming months.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you, Dan. Before we open up to questions, let me do something that I should have done at the outset, which is to show all of you this beautiful new issue of our magazine, The National Interest. This is the September-October issue, and I highlight it especially because we have a symposium with a variety of different perspectives on the U.S.-Russia relationship, a debate. That should be in newsstands, I think, quite soon, and some of the pieces are already online on our website. As I open up to questions, let me ask each of you, as I call on you, please to identify yourself for our speakers, and also to raise your hand so that my colleagues with our microphones are able to find you and ensure that we can all hear your question. So let's open it up. Who'd like to go first? So, sorry, and if I could ask you to wait for the mic. Sorry. Yeah.
Defense priorities. And George, neither one of you sound, I would say, terribly enthusiastic about the sanctions. So given the pessimism or apparent pessimism, George, particularly your analysis, and given, quite frankly, the track record of sanctions, generally speaking, getting any regime, let alone the Russians, to change behavior the way we would want them to change behavior, to me, this sounds like a net negative with a huge downside risk and very little upside. So why are we bothering to do this?
Who wants to take that
We're
first?
probably not the people you should be asking.
And I have a follow-up question, actually, for both of you after that question.
Well, Russia's perspective on this is that this is being done largely for domestic political purposes, and I find it very hard to disagree with that.
I mean, I think if you look at it from a business perspective, if you looked at the Obama era, and business never likes sanctions anywhere. They're not going to. But the Obama administration construct was very understandable, very targeted, very policy specific. This doesn't have that same feel, and the administration went out of its way to try to work with companies to make sure that they had a sustainable, sanctions design with broad support both in the United States and Europe. And I'm not sure that this bill, at least at this point, is going to meet that test. Let me
flip that question around in a way and get both of you to react to a different question. Russia has engaged in all kinds of egregious conduct. Seized Crimea, supporting rebels in eastern Ukraine, intervening in Syria, interfering in the U.S. elections, harassing our personnel in Moscow and elsewhere. I could make a very long list. What is the United States supposed to do about that? How do we respond to conduct like that in a way that might affect Russian conduct and defends U.S. interests, actually, which is our ultimate objective?
I can start on that. That's an excellent question. There's not a short answer to it. I would say the first thing we need to do is to understand very clearly what our own interests are. And then within those interests, what is vital? In other words, what would we go to war to protect? And what is of secondary importance to us in that list of priorities. If you don't understand that first, then you won't know where your red lines really are drawn and where you can afford to compromise, where you can find some common ground. If we do that, if we understand what's critical to us and what's of lesser importance, then you can put together a comprehensive approach to defending those interests and advancing your priorities and understand where it is that you can actually engage in that diplomacy with Russia, where it is that you've got to draw very tough, firm lines, and where you can negotiate. Find some ways to accommodate their interests in all of this. I think if we were to do that, we would find a much more productive way forward than the path that we're on right now, which is going to be really a difficult one to control with real risks of escalation spirals.
Dan?
I'd agree with what George said. I think part of it has to be more active diplomacy. And I think some of us have argued for a long time on Ukraine that the United States should have been more aggressive in trying to play a role in stopping the killing there, rather than having a Normandy format that was largely a European-driven process. So I think that if you're looking at Ukraine, certainly more active targeted diplomacy, high-level diplomacy, if we really wanted to try to deal with that, was probably the right area. And I would come back to a point George made about knowing your own interests. And dividing the United States and Europe is certainly not in our interest.
All right, thanks very much. I have, I think, 6 people, 7 people on my list, but let me start right here, sir.
Yeah, Dick Cody. George, you mentioned deterrence, and of course, yep, there you go. Thank you. You mentioned deterrence. Of course, the other part of our national security strategy is assurance. You know, deter our enemies and assure our allies. So, your last comment on Russia exploiting our allies, in particular, when you take a look at Europe right now, how much assurance do these sanctions that could be negative to them economically and politically, as well as what's going on in the Middle East with the GCC countries, with Russia down there playing very strategically in Syria. So I see it also as a weakening of assurance, and how are they going to exploit it?
I agree. Assurance for our allies is very important. Here again, I think this is an issue where we need to understand our own interests very clearly. There is a temptation sometimes in dealing with partner countries, some of whom are treaty allies, some of whom are friends but don't have treaty obligations that come into play.
Like all those friends without benefits.
Yes. Yes. There's sometimes a temptation to equate their interests with our own, and they naturally want assurance that we'll do the kinds of things that advance their interests. Those interests don't always coincide with our own. So we need to be careful in assuring friends and allies that we keep our own interests foremost in mind in doing that, or we can get into some trouble, and you can get tails wagging dogs where countries to whom we have no treaty obligations, and we may not have a lot of vital interests at stake, succeed in shaping U.S. responses that aren't actually advancing our own priorities.
Anything that you'd like to add, Dan? No? Okay, Ambassador Verspaw.
Thanks very much to the panelists. I think it's important to, as you did, Paul, to recall why these sanctions were imposed in the first place, and it is indeed a long list of egregious Russian behavior, as you described it. I mean, upsetting the whole international rules-based order that we've relied upon for the entire post-war, not just post-Cold War period. So there was serious grounds for doing it, and as George said, we weren't prepared to go to war over what the Russians did in Ukraine. So sanctions were the second best available tool, and I think that they were reasonably effective. They were meant to be, in part, a political statement, but also to impose some real costs, and they did set back the Russian economy. I think most importantly, they did deter the Russians from escalating further, going deeper into eastern Ukraine or even into other parts of Ukraine. I think the reason why we now have this legislation is, of course, that the Congress had no confidence that the Trump administration was prepared to uphold either the sanctions or the international rules-based order. And so there was, I think, a clearly felt consensus across party lines going back to the early days after the inauguration when there was rumors of a unilateral lifting of the sanctions, that Congress needed to step in and kind of enforce the intent of the original sanctions. And so, yes, it is domestically driven. The Russians are right to see it that way because the Congress lost confidence that the administration could be trusted to maintain the sanctions as written. And I think they do have the right based on experience with Jackson Vanik and other historical episodes to worry that these sanctions, once implemented, will never be lifted. But I think that's where the administration needs to seize the opportunity here, not just to grouse about infringements on presidential authority, but to sort of see this as an opportunity to come up with an effective strategy, working with the Europeans, as the legislation urges, and to take advantage of the appointment of a very capable diplomat, Kurt Volker, as the special envoy, to come up with a strategy that holds out a very clear path towards the easing and eventual lifting of the sanctions if the Russians address the reasons those sanctions are put into effect. And I think that's an opportunity to continue to work with Europe rather than at cross purposes. And I hope the administration will do that because the negotiations to date have lacked leverage. They've lacked enough U.S. involvement. And so there's an opportunity here which could actually ease the wider tensions that we have with Russia today. But certainly we should try, even if the odds may be low. And as far as the European reaction, I think the main problem there is the Europeans continue to react to the original version passed by the Senate rather than to the final bill, which was improved in a lot of ways, emphasizing not only that some of the new sanctions are at the discretion of the administration, but that they should only be considered after consultation with allies of the United States. So the Europeans also have an opportunity to work with the administration, and they need to remember why the sanctions were imposed, and to seize the opportunity to shape a continuing strategy that ultimately produces some results in terms of Russian withdrawal from eastern Ukraine. I think some Europeans have indicated that they see the improvements in the legislation. I think German electoral politics may make it difficult for Sigmar Gabriel to join that chorus. But again, remembering why the sanctions were imposed in the first place and the common goal of trying to restore Ukraine's sovereignty over its own territory and as a result ease tensions with Russia, there is an opportunity here. And the Russians, I hope, will not react too hastily before seeing whether the administration makes good on that, the appointment of Volker in particular, to actually leverage an improvement in relations with Russia.
Any response?
Well, I agree with everything you've said. I think that's exactly the way we ought to handle it. I have nothing more to add than that.
No, I mean, look, I agree with you, Sandy, and I'm glad to see Kurt get this position and have a chance to try to do something with it. I think the Europeans, yeah, there were certainly changes made in the legislation, positive ones, from the original Senate Bill 722, and that part at the beginning about urging the need to cooperate with America's allies is a good thing. But there's other pieces in that legislation that that the Europeans don't like, and I don't think they're wrong. You know, there's out-and-out stated opposition to Nord Stream 2 on any basis in the legislation, which, you know, again, you've got legislation that's really long, and it's, you know, it's kind of a yeah, but there's a lot that don't, and on you know, you can argue the European energy security either way, but I think ultimately it's their call and not ours.
Let me perhaps pursue this a little bit further, and I know that Ambassador Burt has a comment on this point also, but the question has come up of sanctions versus going to war. Now, are there military options for the United States that fall between those two poles, right? I mean, we're talking, General Cody mentioned reassuring our allies. The United States is taking a variety of steps now actually to do that. Are there other things that we could or should be doing on that front?
Yeah, I think certainly there are. A lot of the steps that the Obama administration took militarily in Europe to try to assure our allies there of our commitment and our capability to defend them against Russian military activities were necessary. And I think if handled in the right way, they can be a very important support to our diplomatic efforts with the Russians. If handled the wrong way, you can cross that line from assurance and prudence and toughness into provocation. And that's the balance that we've got to handle there. So coordinating the diplomatic arms and the military steps that we've got so that they reinforce each other and produce good outcomes is our challenge.
Dan, any?
Well, I agree with what George said. I think another piece of this has to be you also need a strategy to engage the Russian people. That needs to be part of this as well.
Ambassador Burt, I think you also had a comment on this point.
I just wanted to comment on
We have the mic
Sandy
coming.
Vershbow's remark. And I agree largely with what Sandy said. I mean, I think what this legislation represents is actually the Trump administration's loss of control of its Russia policy. And I think for the very reasons I think that Sandy and others have suggested, because of the lack of trust in the capacity of that administration to pursue what both, for very different reasons, both the Republicans and the Democrats on the Hill think is the correct strategy. I think the Democratic dimension here, party's dimension here, was domestic in the sense of wanting to punish the Russians for this perception that Putin handed the election to Donald Trump and was responsible for Hillary Clinton's defeat, and the perception of many Republicans that, particularly McCain camp of the Republican Party, who feel that or couldn't understand Trump's continuing soft line towards Putin. But the problem with sanctions, and here I somewhat disagree with Sandy, is they are a very, very blunt instrument. And while a group like this, at this lunch, who think politically, can be happy about language that's been inserted in this legislation that says, and by the way, Sandy, it doesn't say consult with U.S. allies, it says coordinate with allies of the United States. That when you talk to sanctions lawyers, they say that doesn't mean anything. They say that language has no meaning, and that under this law, the president now has the ability, if he chooses, to undertake these sanctions, which are going to affect European countries, economies, and companies. And they're going to do so through mechanisms of so-called secondary sanctions, and that is you can have some political language that sounds good, but it doesn't change the decisions that Congress has taken about what the U.S. president can do if he decides to, and and in the case of the Europeans. These companies have general counsels who have to make decisions based on risk, and they're going to make investments based on risk, not on political platitudes. So even the discretionary language in this legislation has an impact, and we will feel it, I believe, in one way or another in terms of EU retaliation.
Thank you very much. We have Robert Mary.
Thank you, Paul. Bob Mary. I'd like to ask a question that bounces off of Paul's question, as amplified by the two ambassadors, in which you gave a litany of bad behavior on the part of the Russians. but the Russians are in a position to, from their perspective, raise the same kinds of questions about us, moving eastward with NATO right up to their border, involvement in Ukrainian affairs, which has traditionally been a part of their sphere of influence. We had a vice president just the other day go to Georgia and practically invite them to join NATO. Very incendiary military action in Syria, uninvited, unlike themselves, and other things of this nature. So looking at it from the Kremlin perspective, they see encroachment on the part of the West. So my question is, given that, and given what George was saying, George, about the reaction that's likely to ensue, what are the prospects that we've reached a point of no return in terms of U.S.-Russian relations? Seems to me that what Dick Burt was saying regarding taking away the prerogative of determining U.S.-Russia relations from the President of the United States, which is not a normal, ordinary thing that happens, every 4 years, pretty significant development. And if that doesn't exist, and we have these sanctions, and we have reaction to the sanctions, and we have the current state of political sentiment in Congress, not in the country, by the way, but in Congress, aren't we going to reach a point of escalation where there's no real easy return?
Well, I don't think we've reached a point of no return yet, but I think we're very close to it.
My question is still relevant.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I think the dangers are very great that we could wind up in an escalatory spiral where the domestic political factors in both Washington and Moscow will reinforce retaliatory steps and get us into a crisis that will be very hard to control. And doing that at a time when the White House has, to a great degree, lost control over Russia policy, and where Congress is ill-suited to day-to-day management of those sorts of situations. It's just not institutionally designed to do that sort of thing. So I think we need to be very careful right now. And in talking about the kinds of steps that we might take and the kinds of things that Russia has done and how do we approach all of this from a policy point of view, I think one big principle we ought to keep in mind is the Hippocratic principle. First, do no harm, because we're entering a situation where that harm could be very grave.
No?
No, I'll just leave
Okay.
that one.
All right. Wayne, Mary, on the right.
Thank you. No relationship to Robert, though I sort of wish there was. I would like to invite the thoughts of both speakers on, one, capacity for sanctions busting, and two, import substitution. Because in the modern world, one of the most lucrative of all activities is sanctions busting. I was recently in Moscow and was able to eat some camembert from Belarus. And certainly a number of countries, including China, have made it clear that helping the Russians to avoid sanctions will not just be an opportunity for them, but an actual priority for both economic and political reasons. On import substitution, I mean, the Kremlin has, of course, essentially trumpeted that these sanctions will allow it to free itself from dependence on Western technologies in the oil sector and agricultural exports and so on and so forth. Those of us who've lived in Russia know that the capacity of that system to resist reforms is extraordinary, unless and until they come under foreign pressure, when their ability to sacrifice to essentially stiff the foreigner is also almost unlimited. So I'd like to get your thoughts on what sectors, what places in the Russian economy you think will genuinely, over, say, a 5 to 7 year period, be damaged by these sanctions, and which will be more or less untouched, and which may actually benefit?
Dan, perhaps we could start with you this time.
That's a tough one, Wayne. I don't think import substitution really works. And I think what the Russians, the sector they'll trumpet the most that's gained from import substitution is agriculture, where you've got growth in the 3 to 4% range, and that's remember, that's year-on-year growth from 2015, so you got a pretty low base. But what you've got when you try to get under the hood of this in agriculture is you've got domestic producers who are using existing capacity to meet demand inside Russia. And they're not investing a lot of money, okay, in new production lines, in exports, which they're very capable of doing, and particularly in pork and chicken at this point, because they have a certain amount of uncertainty caused by sanctions and geopolitical tensions, the same as other businesses. So I haven't really seen that these are, that this has worked in the way of, say, what Ronald Reagan did with Harley-Davidson, where you protect an industry for several years and allow it to kind of get on its feet and become more globally competitive. I haven't seen that. I think that you still ultimately need in Russia for modernization. You need capital, you need technology, and you need project management. And the easiest place to get that is internationally because it already exists rather than trying to develop it on your own. And I think that there are certainly a very significant percentage of the elite and the business people want to see further globalization. And they believe that in some sectors they can be globally competitive. For instance, they could export auto parts, for example, over time. There are some industries like pharmaceuticals where, yeah, you can produce certain generics, but you're not going to come up to world standards to have a world-class healthcare system. So I think the answer is still a more open economy if you want to go forward over the long run. On sanctions busting, and I think that's one of the problems with sanctions design today, is the idea that somehow the United States in areas has exclusive technology that's unavailable elsewhere. I mean, that was the idea behind the Obama administration's sanctions, particularly on the energy sector. And I don't really think that holds up to scrutiny. The United States might have the best technology, might have the best project management, but in today's world there are lots of substitutes out there. So when you impose something like that, what you're really doing is you're allowing other people in the manufacturing world to basically take your place. I mean, you remember the embargo on Soviet Union and the experience that Caterpillar had, where they had a very large percentage of the pipe-laying equipment market in the Soviet Union, and then they were frozen out by the embargo, and what really happened was what most people call backfill from some friendly countries who took over that market, and it took a long time to claw its way back. So this comes back to the idea of don't do harm to your own economy and your own industries while you implement this stuff.
George, no. I mean, it occurs to me, don't sanctions busting and import substitution actually directly contradict one another? By which I mean the sanctions busting kind of reduces the incentive for import substitution. I assume your Belarusian camembert was actually from France, and somebody sold it to Belarus, and then they put a new sticker on it, and they,
But you've got to have, Paul, you've got to have something to substitute. If you're running an automotive assembly plant in Russia, one of your biggest issues, you want to localize, because local products are going to be cheaper, your supply line, everything's closer, everything works better. And most of the foreign automotive producers, what they want is they want the Russian government to give more subsidies and more incentives to the auto parts producers so that they can be more competitive. Yeah, but you don't have, you need something. You need something for import substitution.
Yeah, I'm going to provide a leading answer, which is different than a leading question. One of the areas that I think we need to be careful about is the degree to which sanctions can actually incentivize bad proliferation behavior, where countries seek out new markets among odious regimes when they are denied trade opportunities with the United States in the West. And I think the recent report of the possibility that Ukraine might have provided some missile engines to North Korea is a case in point there.
All an unintended consequence.
Yes.
All right, Dave Majumdar.
So this is a question for both you guys, George and Daniel. So we've been talking a lot about how bad this is going to get once like all these sanctions implemented, and say we start arming the Ukrainians. Is there still any room left for cooperation as we go forward? There's certain areas I think we still have to deal with. I mean, like arms control, for example. I mean, do you see any opportunities where they actually will deal, where our two governments will actually work together, or is this kind of like heading towards what Bob was saying earlier with, kind of a critical point where it's beyond the point of no return?
Well, I think I think one thing that's happened since 2014 that hasn't been good in intergovernmental cooperation was the Obama administration's decision to cut off all of the working groups of the Bilateral Presidential Commission and sort of the day-to-day work between government agencies below the political level. And I don't think that's going to be easy to reconstitute. I think that's going to be really hard. Because right now, if you talk to people in the administration and you're asking, well, what are the conduits for U.S.-Russia interaction, and you'll never get above 3 or 4 names.
So in areas where we might be able to cooperate, I think there are areas in principle where there are some coincident U.S. and Russian interests where ordinarily you would say, hey, those are areas where our interests align, we should be able to cooperate. Those still exist. The difficulty there is that the political environments in both capitals are going to make that cooperation very difficult, and I think we could be overwhelmed by the demands of crisis management and all of this. And I think the recent news reports in the United States that parts of our country are being overflown by Russian surveillance aircraft. Oh my gosh. That didn't happen by accident, of course. There are people in this country that don't like the existing arms control agreements between the countries. These flights have been going on under open skies for a long time. And the transparency that that regime provides, I think, is in our national interest as well as in Russia's national interest. But this is the sort of thing that I think is eroding. And a lot of the arms control frameworks that we have that do serve our national interests, that do act as brakes on escalation, we're starting to lose. So that's an area that I think we're going to have to think very hard about going forward.
All right, yes. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Katrina Manson, Financial Times. I was wondering, in your sweep of the history of sanctions between the two countries, if I could ask you about the important scope, significance of the Magnitsky Act sanctions and how they fit in today into the Russian calculus. And also, you mentioned at the extreme end, Russia perhaps defensively arming North Korea and Iran. I wonder if you see a more intermediate step that might be what scope you see for Russia's continued actions in Afghanistan and Syria.
You want to handle Magnitsky?
Yeah, I'll do Magnitsky. Since I was involved in implementation of the Magnitsky Act, I mean, the Magnitsky Act was quite different in that you had you're talking about a limited number of people who were involved in Sergei Magnitsky's death. And most of the people who were on that sanctions list, I mean, you could probably make a credible case in a U.S. court for them. So I mean, it no matter whether you like the bill or not, the intent is very targeted and very, very specific. And I think that's quite different than what we're talking about today.
Well, now, but wait a minute here, Dan. First of all, it was something that the administration
That was the
So
quid pro quo.
You had one sanction that was in place for way, way too long a period. And the only way you could get that lifted was to agree to a new set of sanctions. And Dan is right that they're targeted, but now you have global Magnitsky. So it's been expanded beyond Russia and to the entire planet. So you're going to have people being sanctioned for human rights abuses around the globe. So, I mean, proving once again that the Congress is never satiated by voting sanctions. They're just going to keep doing this endlessly because it gives them great emotional satisfaction.
So on your question about Afghanistan and Syria, of course there have been some press reports that perhaps the Russians had been providing weapons to the Taliban. We could see, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the kinds of thing that we could see more of for a couple of reasons. One is it's an asymmetric eye poke to the United States in retaliation for some of the things that the Russians think we're doing to them. And also I think the Russians are trying to position themselves for the post-US period in Afghanistan, and they want to have relationships with people that they think are likely to be in power, if not nationally, then regionally, in the northern parts of Afghanistan that most affect Russia's interests. So I would expect the Russians to step up their activity in Afghanistan over time for that, if for no other reason. In Syria, I'm not sure that there's very much prospect for cooperation between the United States and Russia right now, largely for domestic political purposes. I would expect that both we and Moscow would want to coordinate and communicate to avoid military incidents, for example, between our forces there.
Eric Shrive, George Mason University, and I'll pose my question and then reiterate again. Are we underestimating the importance of soft power when we talk about sanctions? In 2 weeks, I will face probably 350 first-year students at George Mason taking my IR class, and I will ask a question: do sanctions work? And I anticipate the answer will be no, because most of my students, I don't want to be stereotypical about them, but most of my students will think, you post sanctions, you post them on Facebook, get 5,000 likes, they work. If you get only 5 likes, they don't work, just lift the sanctions. So we just getting just this new perception of if something's supposed to be, if something is efficient, it must work immediately. But maybe just we underestimate the importance of this prolonged soft power impact that has been, I grew up during Cold War, the impact that as we felt during the 80s and early 90s. Just one example, on Thursday, one of my friends, who is a business professional, female, told me, complained that she spends 16 hours going to Finland and back, spending 2 hours in the customs there and 2 hours back, and just complaining about wasting her time. So why are you wasting your time? Going to Finland, buying cheese, crackers, French wine, and prosciutto. So maybe that's the impact of business women, businessmen who just see the complications and just annoyance and the inconvenience of the sanctions. Maybe it will finally accumulate in something more policy related. So my question is, maybe just we have to be more patient and see that there's a soft power impact will eventually be that straw that to not break, but maybe somehow impact the back of the regime.
I heard that theory about Cuba all the years I worked in the State Department. So I'd respectfully disagree.
I'll offer a less categorical answer. I think that sanctions can be an effective part of a broader strategy if they're coordinated with other elements of U.S. power, and you have a very clear, well-considered objective that's actually attainable. If your objective is you want the Russians to surrender, turn over their country to the United States, and depart the premises, obviously sanctions are not going to be up to that task. So there has to be a proportionality between the goal that you've got, it's got to be achievable, and the tools that you bring to bear on that have to have some prospect of achieving those goals. And I think in this particular case, we don't have a strategy. We don't have a well thought out set of objectives on all of this. It was almost an emotional response. We're angry at the Russians for all kinds of reasons, some of which are very legitimate, and we wanted to do something to register our unhappiness. We've done that. So if your objective is to register your unhappiness, then mission accomplished. If your objective is to get the Russians to abandon Crimea, if that's really your objective, I would argue that these sanctions are not nearly up to that task. So we need to understand what our objectives are, and they've got to be realistic.
James Kitfield.
So George kind of teased out the idea that we need to understand our vital interests versus just our national interests and which ones we'll go to war for and which one we won't. And I was hoping you'd have that discussion because it strikes me as being enlightening in this regard. I see a couple of red lines that might be bumping up against each other. We have Russian interference or intervention in a NATO country as a red line. Russia, as I interpret their actions in Georgia and Ukraine, have a red line that they will not allow big chunks of the former Soviet Union on their border to be drawn into Western structures, whether NATO or the EU. So any more enlightenment on what the red lines are for each of us, and is it a U.S. red line that countries in Russia's orbit, if you will, or on their border, be able to join NATO if they want to? And is it a red line that we have to have Russia give up Crimea and their only Black Sea port? Because it strikes me, as George just said, I can't see sanctions accomplishing that, so we should probably understand our red lines.
I agree. I think that's a discussion we ought to have. I don't think that we've really had the kind of debate over those things in this country that we need to have. It's an important element of putting together an effective strategy toward dealing with Russia and advancing our own interests. And I also agree with that idea that if our red line is that countries bordering Russia ought to have the right to join NATO, not just theoretically, but in practice. We are going to bump up directly against some Russian red lines, and we need to understand that those conflicts are not conflicts that can be resolved diplomatically. If we insist that Ukraine has to be a part of NATO and the Russians insist that they cannot, that's the only way you're going to resolve that is on the battlefield. And we need to understand that we can't approach that topic on the cheap. They're not going to back down, and we're not going to achieve our goals unless we're really serious about putting the full might of U.S. military power behind it. And we ought to be very careful that it really is vital to us before we commit ourselves to that kind of course.
Dan.
Well said.
George, let me press you a little bit on that, because there are different ways to approach Ukraine's NATO membership. One is we want Ukraine to be a member of NATO tomorrow. And another is we want Ukraine to have the option to be a member of NATO 20 years from now when there might be a totally different Russian government, and will any Russian government inherently be opposed to that, or might there be some notional Russian government of the future that would not establish that as a red line?
Well, you can't rule it out altogether, but I think it's very, very unlikely that any Russian government in the conceivable future would be comfortable with Ukraine being a part of the NATO alliance. The question really is, will Russia at some point be like Sweden, right? Really abandon its great power aspirations, see itself as great for its ability to provide a great standard of living to its people. And for all kinds of reasons that are very tied up in Russia's self-conceptions and Russia's own history, I don't think that's very likely. I think we're going to see for the foreseeable future a Russia that believes it cannot remain intact unless it is a great power, projecting power in its immediate neighborhood. So I think it's an unlikely scenario.
Over here. Yes.
Ellen Nakashima with the Washington Post. With respect to the red lines, I wanted to pull out one item from your parade of horribles, which is the Russian interference in the U.S. election last year. George, do you have any reason to doubt the conclusion of the intelligence community that Russia interfered, and with the intent to at least help Donald Trump? Not maybe he didn't succeed in in any ways, but did he intend to help Donald Trump win the election? And if so, is that a red line that is crossed? Should we punish Russia for that? And if so, in what way? In what way can he be punished? And then what way can Russia be deterred from doing something again in the future without risking the sort of escalation that we've been talking about before? And is this an area in which we can reasonably enlist the help of the Europeans, since they also seem to have an interest in deterring Russia from interfering in their elections? This is something that our intelligence community professionals have said is kind of unprecedented in the United States when it comes to the use of cyber. I think Mike Hayden said it was the most successful covert operation in history. It might be a bit of hyperbole, but anyway, you get my point. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yes.
Exactly.
Well, first I want to say that Paul had told me there would be no hacking questions today. But
I didn't get the message, sorry.
So on the question of the intelligence community's conclusions and what I think about them, there are really three conclusions that were prominent in that intelligence community assessment that got published in January. One was that Russian hackers were the ones that hacked the DNC servers. The second was that they did it on the explicit order of President Putin. And the third was that the objective behind all this was both to advantage Trump and to undermine our democracy and the broader liberal international order. So I'll address each of those points and tell you what I think. On the first point, was it Russian hackers that hacked the DNC servers? I don't know. I have a good deal of uncertainty about that. I'm open to persuasion that it was Russian hackers. In fact, I think, on balance, it probably was Russian hackers that did it. But the case hasn't been made, at least not publicly. And we haven't seen the kind of evidence that would go beyond, trust us, we're the intelligence community, we know what we're talking about, and this is what we think. The second point, was it President Putin that specifically ordered those hacks? On that, I'm much more skeptical. Doubtful even, for a variety of reasons. But from what I understand from Washington Post reporting, there was a single piece of evidence that figured very prominently in the conclusion that Putin himself had ordered this. And anytime you're relying on a single source for a conclusion of that kind of magnitude, you'd better be very, very confident in the veracity of that source. So automatically, I'm a little bit skeptical of that conclusion. And the other thing is, contrary to what a lot of people think about how Russia is governed, President Putin does not decide everything that happens. It's a very large country. It's a large government. A lot of people are doing a lot of things. He has limited time and capacity for doing all these sorts of things. I think if Russian hackers were in fact the ones that penetrated the servers, they probably did so without President Putin saying, go do this as a part of this broader campaign. He was probably informed about it after the fact. The last conclusion, that the Russians were trying to advantage President Trump and undermine our democracy and the broader liberal order, I'm actually, I think there's very little evidence to support that. That's the judgment that I think is I'm most doubtful about.
So we have been sitting in
December, you probably would not have recommended that the Obama administration issue package of sanctions on December 29th in response to these actions.
What I think I would have recommended had I been asked my opinion, the Russians, it's one thing to go to President Putin saying, hey, look, we've got the goods, we know what you did, you know what you did, it was wrong, and we're going to punish you, and because you know it was wrong, you're going to sit there and take it, because you know that the punishment is justified. The other way you can do it is you can say, you know, something happened that was wrong, and it should never happen again. And you will agree that it will never happen again because you agree that it was wrong without acknowledging that you did it, right? I think that kind of approach was very doable. I think that the Russians have reasons of their own to want to agree essentially to a mutual non-aggression pact in the cyber world. They've got some very vulnerable infrastructure of their own that we're more than capable of attacking. They, in fact, have mooted the possibility of an agreement that we're not going to attack each other's critical infrastructure. So that kind of thing could be done. I think maybe the window of opportunity for that is passed. But how you approach that diplomatically has a big impact on the prospects for success there.
Thank you.
All right, we have Ruth Wedgwood over here, and then David Ignatius. I saw you back there.
Well, first, just as a quick little prelude, as you know, Tsar Alexander I is my personal hero in all of celestial history. So I think Russia actually has a very glorious past in having added to the law of war and humanitarian interventions and helping us win the Civil War, as you all know, by keeping the Brits and the French away. But I guess this almost seems like something for a psychiatrist rather than a strategist. We can't ourselves cure a Russian feeling of inferiority, and they're not intellectually inferior. So I just wonder whether it's the personality in the White House that's at issue, or the personality in the Kremlin, or just that we, because of the prior badinage, have not identified enough, a nice little package of 6 topics on which we could each be productive and cooperative, that somehow it's just become this kind of football match with all of our brains getting mashed. So if you were suggesting a few things where, in fact, the tonality of the relationship could be transformed, what would they be? Fighting berry in Africa, whatever.
I think the traditional playbook on that has been arms control. Has usually been the start of any kind of rapprochement because of the way the United States and Russia line up on those issues. I think the disagreements over the INF Treaty and whether Russia has violated that make that a hard starting point this time. I'd like to see something involving, terrorism and countries we mutually have trouble with as a good starting point, but certainly experience in Syria doesn't bode well for that. I don't know, George, if you have a brighter idea.
I don't, unfortunately. I think under different political circumstances in both countries, there would be opportunities for starting small, where you've got some mutual interests and trying to build trust over time through some success. But I think that chapter has ended in our relationship, and I think we're going to very quickly be in the crisis management mode here. Now, depending on how those crises evolve, we may find ourselves in a situation where we start to realize that we do need to do more to minimize the prospects of dangerous confrontation between our countries, and we may be able to start to rebuild some trust and get beyond where we are right now, but we're not there yet.
Because if I could just mention, in the olden days at Yale, Russia was a very attractive concentration. Laurie Damrosch took Russian, Paul Stefan took Russian. Now nobody takes Russian. So it's almost as if we'd wiped them off the map as a cultural phenomenon as opposed to a strategic enemy.
Mr. Ignatius. Yes, sir. Let me perhaps just briefly follow up on this issue of trust, because that's an issue that Secretary Tillerson actually raised. How do we address that? Is there a way to address it? If there isn't a way to address it, what happens to this relationship? Certainly there are good reasons for U.S. officials to mistrust their Russian counterparts. I'm sure their Russian counterparts probably feel like there are good reasons for them to mistrust us. Is there anything we can do about that? Should we try to do anything about that?
I don't know if you're back to a Cold War playbook where you need to go small for small and start with something easy. The alternative is you wait till there's a crisis, say North Korea or something else that naturally drives you together, where you have to work together, and that becomes a forced sort of confidence building approach. I mean, those are the two ways that this has traditionally happened.
It's a very good question, and I wish I had a good answer.
Can I follow up on this trust question? Because
sure.
I think before you can ask the issue, address the issue of U.S.-Russian trust, we've got to raise our own domestic trust issue, and that is, how does the Trump administration regain the trust of the Congress so that it can even conduct a policy towards Russia?
I leave that to you, Rick.
That's a very good point. Linda and Alan.
Sandy?
Right here.
Nobody's going to answer it, though.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have anything? No? Do you?
Yeah, well, I think you've asked, again, the right question. It's not just the trust between Congress and the White House, which is lacking right now. I think the broader levels of trust in our society have really declined over the last few decades. And that is problematic. We're seeing some of the political implications of that declining trust. So it affects our ability to govern ourselves effectively and to put together coherent approaches internationally. And is compounded by the lack of trust between Russia and the United States. So it's a very serious problem, and I don't know how you easily address that, because I think it's a complex systems problem. There are a lot of different components that interact with one another to produce the problem, and if you address just one of them, you don't solve it. You've got to address multiple things simultaneously in order to improve the atmosphere. That's a hard thing to do.
Well, I'll hopefully ask a slightly easier question. Dan, you were running through some of the new aspects of the legislation, and one of the ones that you didn't specifically mention or underline and that hasn't gotten a lot of attention is the I believe it's an amendment to one of the Ukraine acts from 2014 that talks about sanctions being on offer for any individuals involved in serious human rights abuses in areas forcibly occupied or otherwise controlled by the Russian Federation. So to me this seemed new because it opens up potential sanctions involving Russian activities in countries other than Ukraine, specifically Moldova and Georgia. And I just wonder if either of you have any comment on whether you think that was, what the specific intention of that was, how that may be implemented, because it seems, as I said, like it's a game changer for some small areas at any rate.
I would go back to what George said about this legislation being an emotional response. And I mean, it has something for everybody in here. I mean, we haven't talked about the other pieces, about oligarchs, about corruption, about human rights. There are lots of things in this legislation that we're going to have to see how they're implemented or what the Trump administration chooses to do with them. But it's a pretty big canvas to color on. And the issue you raise is certainly one of them.
I would agree.
Anybody else? Paul, and then we'll come back to you, Sandy. This is Paul Pillai.
Yeah, there's been a lot of pessimism expressed about potential for U.S.-Russian cooperation in addressing common problems, arms control, and so on. And I just suggest that a couple of the areas where you might see cooperation, if, to the extent we're not seeing it, it's not because of hang-ups about the U.S.-Russian relationship, but rather hang-ups about the specific issues that are on the table. And I'd mention two. One is Syria, where there is a lot of convergence of interest if we get past, the rhetoric on each side. The Russians clearly want an Assad regime to stay in power in Damascus, but also recognize, I would submit, that that regime is not going to control all of Syrian territory, that there will be, if this war is ever going to end, some kind of negotiated settlement, where most of the action right now is the Astana process, where it's the Russians, Turks, and Iranians, and we've been kind of on the periphery. There's a set of realities there that I think if we got over such things as the inability to let go of this Assad must go view, and we saw a little bit of that when the news came out in the last couple of weeks about the administration discontinuing the aid for the anti-regime rebels. There was a lot of pushback from Senator McCain and others. I would submit that's the barrier to U.S.-Russian cooperation rather than a hang-up about our relationship with the Russians. And even clearer, perhaps, is Iran and the nuclear agreement, where we work closely and effectively, or the we being the Obama administration, with the Russians as well as the European and Chinese to negotiate that agreement, where there's still a lot of common interest in making it work. But as we all know, the current occupant of the White House is moving in a different direction for reasons that don't necessarily have anything to do with relations with Russia, but rather for other reasons. So I just want to make that point that it's not so much the view of the bilateral relationship sometimes, but rather the all the baggage that goes with some of the issues.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the difficulties that we face in Syria is at a very broad level, U.S. and Russian national interests are not all that incompatible. The Venn diagram shows a lot more overlap than divergence there. However, that's an area where I think the White House faces some very severe constraints on its ability to show flexibility there. The ending of the covert action program that you talked about, not without controversy in and of itself, which shows you there's some fairly formidable domestic political forces there that are already starting to be alarmed about the direction we might be going. And if you combine that with the great suspicions that a lot of people have here about the Trump administration's willingness to make some sorts of deals with Moscow, I think that really sharply circumscribes our flexibility there in Syria. In Iran, I think there's a real divergence between Russia's perceptions of Iran and its role in that region, and this White House's perception of Iran and its roles in the region. So that's an area where there may actually be some serious differences between what the Kremlin preference might be in dealing with Iran and what the Trump administration's preferences might be, which again will limit the prospects for cooperation there.
Ambassador Vershbow, back to you.
Thanks. I want to just come back to the question of, do we have a strategy with respect to sanctions or don't we? Because there was a lot of doubt that we do, and I think that's not entirely fair. Clearly sanctions are not going to be the magic wand that helps us overcome all the differences in U.S.-Russian relations. If we were to try to do that, it would be counterproductive, I agree. And the relationship, I would argue, is going to remain largely competitive because of conflicting worldviews and Russia's, as George said, feeling that it can only be a great power by dominating its neighbors, projecting power in the near abroad. So we have some fundamental difference we have to manage. Hopefully arms control, confidence-building measures can be revived, but even there the Russians don't seem too interested at the moment, but that's a separate discussion. But I think sanctions can address one particular problem, which is the Ukraine crisis, which is where the real breakdown in the relationship took place. The bulk of the sanctions enacted by Obama and now enshrined in legislation relate to Ukraine. And if the Trump administration is skillful in using them as part of a strategy to achieve not only de-escalation, but actual implementation of the Minsk agreements and withdrawal of Russian troops and proxies, in return for Ukraine agreeing to autonomy, special status, all the things that they're supposed to do under Minsk, you could at least see a finite step away from the brink in today's U.S.-Russian relations. And it would be a basis for continued unity with the Europeans who share the same goal. So I think if we focus on that and use sanctions as a tool, and it's not only using sanctions relief, but also the potential escalation of sanctions. And one thing we haven't discussed today is the provisions in the bill relating to the intelligence and defense sectors. Those create the possibility of imposing secondary sanctions on countries who continue to buy Russian arms, which aren't the European allies, so they can't complain about that one. But it does potentially impose some real costs on Russian export revenue if we play it skillfully and gradually over time. Countries like India, China are big arms purchasers from Russia. We might be able to hurt the Russians using this instrument if efforts at diplomacy to solve the Ukraine crisis are rebuffed by the Russians. So let's look at what we could do with sanctions and not sort of despair that these are just aimless, misdirected weapons that aren't really achieving any strategic objectives. In the negotiations, the issue of NATO will come up. I personally believe we should never give up the right of a country to seek NATO membership. And the Russians have agreed to that in the Helsinki Final Act, in the Charter of Paris, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, all these things. They signed up to this. But whether, under what conditions it happens is a different question, as Paul said. I think if the Russians are interested in a real solution in Ukraine, we can find some way to at least address that issue in the short to medium term while preserving Ukraine's rights in the long term. And as for the hacking sanctions, I'm glad we did impose some punishment, but we may be wiser to focus more on deterrence, basically reducing our own vulnerability to future hacking of our political process, deprive the Russians of the ability to have a strategic impact in the future and not expect them to give us any assurances that we would be able to count on, even against critical infrastructure. They'll pledge not to attack it until they do. So focus on increasing our invulnerability and assuming the Russians are going to do the same.
All right, last comment or question from our president, Dmitry Symes, and then I'll give each of you a chance to respond briefly.
What Ambassador Vershbow have said, I basically agree with. I think that it's very clear that the reason we're discussing sanctions against Russia, is not because of sanctions per se, because there is very little Russia can do, or for that matter is even planning to do against the United States economically. The options are limited and they understand that. The reason I think we're discussing sanctions against Russia, because they're part of an overall dynamics of the US-Russian relationship. And as Ambassador Vershbow said it, most of us agree that we need to step away from the brink. But I know Ambassador Vershbow well enough to add, and Sandy, you may correct me if I am wrong, you also feel that the need to step away from the brink should not paralyze the United States into impotence in responding to Russian actions or deterring Russian actions, which we consider disagreeable. This is a very serious matter. What concerns me most actually is not this particular bill, and there are a lot of elements in the bill which make sense on some specific grounds. But we have a political process in Washington when everybody agrees that the sanctions were passed, at least in part, not because of what we needed to do vis-a-vis Russia, but because of a fundamental distrust between the administration and Congress. And it's very clear to me that the administration failed to articulate a coherent Russian strategy. And obviously telling how Putin allegedly admired then candidate Trump is not a sound reason for US-Russian normalization. Conversely, it's very clear that the Russians, they were denying the obvious and talking about a matter of trust, their conduct during the campaign and before the campaign, how to put it delicately, did not contribute to our ability to work together. I think we have some very hard choices to make, And my hope is that we would address these choices in the spirit of President Reagan, who did not like the Soviet regime, who took very tough measures, including using sanctions, to put pressure on the Soviet Union, both to punish them and to reduce their defense capacity. But at the same time, we should remember that unless we know how to defeat Russia, it's in our interest to look for some way to be able to work together, at least on managing our differences.
Comment, final word, George?
I very much agree with that. I would say that when it comes to Ukraine, sanctions can be a very important piece of a broader strategy for managing and containing that problem, if not solving it. I'm more skeptical, I think, than you are, Sandy, about how coherent that broader strategy is. And part of the reason is I'm not sure we really know what we want the Russians to do that would allow a lifting of sanctions. Is it, as you had mentioned earlier, not move further westward to reduce or end their support for ethnic Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine? Is it to actually return Crimea? Some of those things are doable. Some of them I think are not. And I'm not sure we have a very clear idea in Washington of what our objectives are, and we need to have that.
Dan.
I agree with you, George, and I won't repeat what you just said. I also think on the converse side, sometimes I wonder how clear the Russian strategy is for what they want in Ukraine. So
they know what they don't want, I think.
Right, but
yeah.
there's two sides of this
right.
coin. But I just add on our own side, the Russians aren't going to move off the planet, and at some point we're going to have a better, or at least a better mutual understanding. And I think while we've got this really difficult political relationship, it's worth pursuing some of those other avenues we've used in the past in terms of cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, economic and commercial relations, to try to build some level of interaction between the two peoples while we have this very difficult geopolitical situation.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you to all of you for being with us today.
Nice to see you.
Okay.